Thank you, Claire. Brian Boyle and I co-founded Model D about 6 years ago, and how we ended up actually kind of getting involved. We really wanted to talk about what was next for Detroit. And our backgrounds were, prior to this, I had a tech firm in Detroit in the Fisher Building for about 10 years, and we did work all over the country. But one of my largest clients ended up being the state of Michigan. Their efforts in economic development and community development, really trying to figure out why companies move where they move and why people move where they move. But in about 2004, I was approached to sell that company, so I did. And then I continued doing that work with the state and sat on a board where I met Brian. And Brian was working with Viacom, very large media company. They were watching traditional media sink. Viewership, listenership, trying to figure out what to do online. So they started working on this concept about online magazines that came out free to the reader. They came out once a week on niche subjects. So what we did is we kind of took my background and his background, put them together, and we created Model D. And so since then, we've actually taken the model that we created here in Detroit with Model D. We've now created 19 of them across the US and into Canada. We now have a little over 450 journalists that write for us on a weekly basis. And really, it came out of a couple different observations that we made about the media. The first observation that we made was that the media is largely obsessed with loss. So if there's job loss, really well covered. Fire, murder, crime, scandals, all that stuff, incredible amounts of coverage. And we understand why. I mean, you need journalists to bring sunlight to corruption and all that and make the community better. But we felt there was this huge gap. We were watching our friends invest at the neighborhood level, revitalizing neighborhoods, building companies, and none of it saw any coverage in traditional media. So what we looked at is, what if we could start hiring the journalists away from the newspapers, or those that were being laid off, hire them, and instead of having them go find crime and do the crime blotter for the neighborhoods, what if we were to hire them and talk about the investments being made, the people doing the work, the doers in the community? And so that's really what we've been doing. We've really been trying to figure out what's next. And the only way we could figure out how to get at what was next was to follow investment, and not just dollars, not just real estate investment or jobs being created, but the people who are actually creating the programs, the thought leaders and the doers who you're about to hear from. The other piece of it was, we really didn't find language for this until we ended up in Pittsburgh. After Model D launched, we were invited to come to Pittsburgh by Carnegie Mellon to consider doing a Model D-like thing there, and we ended up doing that. But I have to admit, I had really never been to Pittsburgh, so I didn't know much about Pittsburgh. So we were arriving in town, and I guess in my mind, I had these images of dirty-faced steel workers and plumes of dark smoke over the city, and abandoned steel plants everywhere. And of course, when we arrived, it was a beautiful city. I mean, the architecture is incredible, where it sits within the landscape, green building everywhere. And we started figuring out quickly that the narrative about places often doesn't match what's going on the ground right now. That the narrative may be aged. So the narrative for Pittsburgh was old steel town, what's on the ground now. Steel's probably not what's next for Pittsburgh. So what we wanted to do is, how do we start closing that gap between what's next and what's actually happening on the ground? So what we want to do is try and help people see places differently. So I don't know if you're seeing mastheads behind me, but really what we're trying to do with that is, each week, those mastheads are the cover of our magazine. They're the first thing you see when you receive Model D or you open it up. And the idea is that we want you to stop for just a moment and think about it just a little differently than you have. And it might be a small little shot of something, but we want to help people think about places differently. And one way that we do that is we also have a little bit of an evidence-based model. Which is, we actually go out and we have journalists assigned at the neighborhood level to go finding all the investments being made in real estate, for example. That we want to show the dollars being invested, not the speculation that someday something will happen somewhere. And we're also not as interested in big things. We're not as interested in the $250 million waterfront project as we are the 6 units of infill development in Corktown. And so what we do each week is we assign journalists to go out and cover those stories. and really try and get beyond a lot of what we've kind of started to call the STP, or the same 10 people that the media write about week after week. We know what they're going to say, and what we want to do is instead hear from the people who are sitting in the front row here, who may not always have a platform in traditional media. But what we found is that our partners are traditional media in some cases. People like WDET and NPR will work and kind of use us as a story farm of sorts to find stories that we're doing. We collaborate with them on the speaker series and things like that. The other thing that we wanted to do was also get at the neighborhood discussion. What we noticed is when we went to cities like New York, neighborhoods played a significant role. The distinctions between Soho and the Upper East Side and Chelsea and Williamsburg, I mean, these people wrap their identities around these places, and they were really important. But for Detroit, most people for a long time have seen Detroit at large, like as one big downtown. Like downtown for a lot of people started at 8 Mile. I mean, it sounds a little crazy because there are about, 77 distinct neighborhoods in the city of sorts. So what we wanted to do was have our journalists assigned at the neighborhood level, covering that content. And so when you read Model D, you'll see what neighborhood it's in. So if you're thinking about going into Woodbridge, you can see what's happening there. So a lot of what we're trying to do is raise the visibility of what's working. Model D, we often get lumped into this category of good news. We really don't see ourselves that way. We're not covering who won the spelling bee. Really what we want to do is follow the people who are doers, who are creating what's next, and we want to raise the visibility of those things, so hopefully we'll see more of it. So thank you, and next.